1 and 2. So the first section of the book is about emptying the cup. When you're emptying the cup, there's a section in there called the white belt. And when you're learning a new thing, in martial arts, for example, you don the white belt. You accept that you have a plateau of competence. You are coding. You code all the time. You know what coding is. You're confident in your abilities to do these things. You have pride in the skills that you've developed. Sometimes you find it maybe hard to acquire new skills. You feel maybe a little bit stalled. It's like, I've been in this technology a while. I'd like to try something new. But when you jump into something new, I'm going to channel Yoda, you must unlearn what you have learned. You're going to come to any new thing you learn with all of these ideas that aren't necessarily going to apply. And so you have to drop those and be open to learning the new things. So we'll get started. Feel free to groan. Anybody know what programming language this is? JavaScript. Sorry, I have a few of these. Anybody know the four rules of simple design? You've seen these before? Tests pass, express intent, don't repeat yourself, and small. Code without tests is bad code. Doesn't matter how well written it is, how pretty or object-oriented or well encapsulated it is. With tests, you can change that code confidently. That's Michael Feathers in Working Effectively with Legacy Code. If you haven't read that book, it's an awesome book. So think about what kind of tests you do. I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production. To fit anybody. Cowboys in the audience, cowgirls in the audience. So think about the testing that you do. When we talk about testing in the 4 rules, we don't necessarily have to mean automated testing because you may not be in an environment that can support that quite yet. It's tough to get sometimes to a place where you can do automated testing well. But what are your exploratory testing practices? Do you do script-driven testing? What do you do for testing? Hopefully you don't just throw it in production. So the second rule is expressing intent. And I talk a lot here about the principle of least astonishment. So this is often measured by WTFs per hour. If you look out in the team and see how many people are in what the, right? You don't want too many of those. The result of performing some operation should be obvious, consistent, and predictable based on the name of the operation and other clues around in the code. That's Ward Cunningham. His C2 wiki, if you haven't been on it, is an excellent collection of software development principles, practices, and ideas. So there are 2 hard things in computer science. You heard this one before? Cache invalidation. Anybody deal with this? Like for real? Not just use a framework to do it, but actually try to solve these kinds of problems. It's freaking hard. You know what's harder? Naming things. Damn near impossible. Oh, right, and off by 1 errors. Wait for it. So the third rule is don't repeat yourself. And a lot of people misinterpret don't repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself isn't necessarily the same code, the same characters on the screen repeated across the screen. It's more about knowledge in the system. You don't want 2 different areas in your software system being responsible for the same thing or having the same knowledge about the problem you're trying to solve. So every piece of system knowledge should have one authoritative, unambiguous representation. It's really important. And that's Dave Thomas. If you've ever read The Pragmatic Programmer, that's an awesome text. Oops. And a lot of them don't repeat yourself. We talk about the single responsibility principle. And this is principle number 1 in Uncle Bob. I call him Uncle Bob. It's Robert C. Martin's solid principles that he talks a lot about. If you've ever read Clean Code or watched the Clean Coders videos, they're very good. And he talks a lot about things like in object-oriented programming, a class should only have one reason to change. You shouldn't have to be going in and making sweeping changes through your code to affect changes in your system. You should be able to localize a lot of that. And finally, small. And I always quote Mark Twain here. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. It takes time and effort, and it's really hard to build something small and simple. It's really, really, really hard. So it's worth doing. It's hard. But what does small mean when it comes to software? Are we talking about lines of code? How many classes are in the system? How many functions are in the system? How long are the functions? What are some different ways you can measure small? Throw them out. Well, you should know this one. So we talk a lot about cohesion and coupling when you're building out systems. And, way back in the day, I'm old. So remember classic ASP? How many of you have coded in classic ASP on the server side? Oh yeah. How many of you opened up that Access database and read some columns and dropped them right on the screen in the ASP script mixed in with your HTML? Yeah, that looks kind of like this, right? That's a very low cohesion environment unless you really make a lot of efforts to separate things apart, right? To put the code in one place and put the HTML in another. Code behind, if you're familiar with that, was beautiful in forcing that separation and making people think about drawing those concerns apart. And over time, working with a system, things can start to come in focus. If you start into a code base like that, I call it wicked code. It's very hard to understand. But as you begin to come to an understanding of what the code base is doing and what it's trying to accomplish, you start to see patterns. And you can start to draw them apart and group them. So these boundaries between things, we've got color, we've got shapes, in my picture here. We have size. This all relates to code, right? So 2 things you might want to separate would be HTML and C#, for example. Things that you might want to separate would be really high-level abstractions, like business rules, from, say, string manipulation, low-level details, right? You want to keep those apart. So you have a nice ordered system. Not many people operate here. This is not reality. Most of the projects tend to be around here. If you're really, really lucky, you might get to here. All right. PHP. If you haven't seen this talk, who's seen this talk from Gary Bernhardt? Yeah, the birth and death of JavaScript. It's like a future history. JavaScript, thank you. So it's like a future history of JavaScript, where it was born, where it came from, how it was used, and right into the future. And it's awesome. It's very, very good. Because JavaScript kind of crept up on us as a legitimate programming language. 10 years ago, it was a toy. Nobody coded anything serious in JavaScript. It made little things move on the screen in your browser, right? Who was doing anything serious with it? Then Gmail came out. Holy crap. We can do stuff with this, right? So Google is a big sponsor behind Angular. they've been doing this stuff for a really, really long time. They've tried all kinds of different approaches to it. So in 2008, we had JavaScript The Good Parts, which is an excellent book, a little dated. Node.js in 2009, the community started to build. And these days, my favorite source for JavaScript stuff is JavaScript Jabber by DevChat TV. It's a weekly podcast. It's really good. They cover current stuff, and they cover a lot of different things. Everything from DevOps to different frameworks to different environments to weird technologies. And they have good speakers on it. I mentioned Ward Cunningham. He was just on it because he's written in JavaScript a distributed real-time updating wiki technology. But it was kind of his first crack into JavaScript, and he kind of enjoyed how the JavaScript community kind of fostered him along in building out his technology. But there's a lot of really interesting things happening in the Java space. A lot of the cool kids that did Rails and Ruby back in like mid-2000s, a lot of us have moved on to do a heck of a lot of JavaScript work. So there's a lot of really heavy thinking behind how to put this stuff together. A little bit of Common Lisp. So you've been lied to. What you've been told is MVC isn't MVC. MVC is like, anybody done small talk? So, yeah. So, yeah. A lot of what you're familiar with as people are calling MVC, that tends to be like server-side frameworks, is generally what they call Model 2. And it's really the same roots as classic ASP, JSP, PHP, those kinds of technologies. And MVC has become kind of a buzzword, right? But it's not really that informative about a good application architecture. And a lot of how this applies is because using something like Angular is going to challenge how you think about building web applications in a large way. So why Angular? Why not? There's a lot of tech to choose from, right? Angular's got lots of attention, and that tends to be the biggest thing that gels a technology. The community kind of gloms onto it, and it becomes a thing. Google's behind it, which is nice, but there are other emerging technologies like React, and Facebook's behind that. They're no small. So it's an interesting time to be building web applications, especially. And I'm pretty flippant about which one to use, and it not really mattering because of where we are with JavaScript technologies. One of the things that tends to gel an ecosystem is its understanding of package and dependency management. And this is something that the Node community solved really, really well for JavaScript. And so there are tools and package management systems and build tools that will help you assemble your JavaScript applications in a really nice, consistent, and easy-to-use manner. And how you assemble the code, because things are so well supported from a modular perspective, you can build modules and assemble them underneath whatever frameworks really you want to use them with if you're careful. You can assemble the logic of your application and drop it into Angular or drop it into React. It's not crazy. It's possible. If you haven't tried it yourself, anybody actually tried to build stuff in Angular yet? So I should have asked that like right at the beginning. Awesome. So there's a free Google-sponsored Code School course. Take 1 to 3 hours to go through it, depending on how quick you do. If you haven't used any of the stuff on Code School, it's really good. You can just Google Angular and Code School, and you'll get the link right into it, or you can pull it off of here. The thing I like about Code School is you're not just sitting back watching a video. You watch a video, and then you write code. And then you watch a video, and then you write code. And it tests your code and recognizes when your code is correct, mostly. But it's really good. Interactive teaching tool. So let's write some code. It's one of my favorite people right now, Sandy Metz. She wrote a really good book the past year on object-oriented design. Written it from the perspective of Ruby, but the object-oriented design principles all carry through, and it's very cool. So anyways, one of my favorite slides. Plus, there's not enough women in computing. Come on, what is this? All right. So I'm not a big fan of starting too deep into something. Well, I got to be careful how I phrase things. We're going to start a project, and we're going to throw some Angular in it. It's going to be an empty project. I'll just call it that. Need my notes. Visual Studio is not my, like I say, my most comfortable environment. I did get into using NuGet for pulling in some packages. I'll talk later how it bit me. But it was a reasonable first start, and it got me rolling. So I'm using Angular, so I really want Angular. And hopefully I'm still on the internet. Gotta love live demos. Huzzah! And I just want core. We're not going to do anything too crazy right now. So you're going to drop in Angular. I'm a big fan of automated testing, so I can't help but dropping in Jasmine. Jasmine is a behavior-driven development framework for JavaScript. I just like the language that it uses. So I'll drop it in. And, yes, the thing that I searched around for, looking for a nice solution, and I found Chutzpah, which is really cool. Anybody use Chutzpah? It's a JavaScript testing plugin for Visual Studio and a runner environment to let you run your scripts. It plugs into its Test Explorer, so you can do all your JavaScript unit tests in there. So there we go. We're ready to roll. We've got some scripts. We just need an HTML page. You guys should be pretty familiar with what I'm doing here so far. Just going to create an index. Huzzah, an index. So Angular, I'm going to start really small here. We're talking about single page apps. You've got one web page that's going to drive everything about your application on the client side, right? And so that web page, now hang on, let me back up a little. That's like full-on single-page app, right? If you're trying to roll this kind of stuff into an existing project, usually you can't take that step, right? You can't just throw the world away and start again. So it's not the only way to do this. You can begin to bring Angular into your project kind of piece by piece. So if you've got a whole bunch of web pages, but you want to try a little Angular on this page here because you want it to be a bit more interactive on the client side, you can do that. It's totally okay. And that can kind of spread out through the rest of your application if you want. Or if you don't like it, throw it out. So this is an Angular app. Hang on, that's got to be hard to see. Can anybody read that? I suppose I can. I don't know the key combinations, but I know how to do this. Opa. I need Angular actually in here, so I'm just going to drop it in. And yeah, that pretty much does me. So Angular now We'll load from that script. We'll recognize that the HTML page it's on is an Angular app and is now ready to work for us. So if I do an expression, and it uses kind of handlebar or mustache syntax, depending on the word you want to use, and I say 2 plus 2, right? If everything works, we get 4. Angular is up and working and functional. That's it. What I have there, a couple of files. Does not need to be a big thing. And that's part of what I like about Angular. You can start and think about how you want to apply it and make it work for you. There we go. What are we doing next? Yes. Well, we can't write our code like this. This would be like going back 15 years, right? So Angular organizes your blocks of your application using modules. And that's kind of its first order of organization. And so we want to begin bringing this logic down in behind into something. We're going to have to start creating that. Oops. Had me for a second. Okay. I don't like the way this is organized. I'm going to create a different folder for my app stuff. I like to keep my scripts from third-party vendors in one place and the scripts for me, my app, in another place. I'm not using any particular build tools here on the JavaScript side. I'm just kind of letting Visual Studio do the work, just because I was thinking maybe that's where you guys would be most familiar and comfortable. But I tend to use environments that kind of came from the Node community, and they actually go out and grab all the scripts I need and all their dependencies and drop them into a little vendored area for me automatically. Kind of like NuGet is doing here inside Visual Studio, but I don't like to mix them up. In some of the templates you get, you start to see these folders and files getting mixed together. That's just not what I like to do. So I'm going to start with a JavaScript file I'm going to put code in. And I'm going to put it in here. That's just not very helpful. I'm not using these yet. All right. So what does an Angular application look like? Well, if you're familiar with including JavaScript on a page, the JavaScript interpreter is just going to start running this file. One of the things that I do is I do everything in closures. There's one thing that bugs me is variable definitions sitting out there in global namespace. It makes me crazy. It reminds me of that big fuzzy cohesion diagram where like everything's mixed together. Oh yeah, sorry. Call me on that, please. Thank you. And so what does this look like? I do have to spell Angular correctly. Look at that. I'm going to create a module. I'm going to stick it in a variable called app. Really, that's about it. Now, we're compartmentalizing all the things we're building in now. So let's start with a controller. Did I get smart or did I not get smart? I knew I'd get caught up doing a whole lot of typing. So I created some snippets, but I don't think I created one for the controller. All right, well, that'll start there. Main controller. Don't know what to call this thing. Oh, you didn't see that. So I've got a controller now that can contribute information to the page or logic to the page. And we'll do the classic thing. Why not? So how do I get that to the page? A couple of things I have to do. I've declared a namespace for my application now and started putting things in that namespace. So I have to tell that ng-app directive what that namespace is. I called it main. Made sense to me. Two hard things in computer science. And get this hello property and a main controller. We can start getting a little fancy. The DOM is a big whole container thing, right? It's this tree of containers inside of containers inside of containers. Beautiful hierarchy. Let's layer our controllers in the same way. So I'm going to drop this controller right up at the top in the body. And I'm going to give it an alias. So that down here I can say, show the hello property of main. Does that make sense? Tell me if I'm going too slow or too fast. Sure can. The JavaScript. So I have a hello property. So this is kind of a special variable in JavaScript, right? If you're familiar with carrying this around. Sometimes it gets awkward to carry this around and put this where you want it. I'll illustrate that later. Anybody catch the bug? I didn't execute my closure. So I'm declaring an anonymous function, and I'm going to run that function right away. It's not going to pollute global namespace with this app variable. It's just going to create this Angular module in Angular land and put a controller in it. Nice and clean and compartmentalized. That's it. Does it work? Oh, kaboom. And Nomad. Very interesting. Usually these are very simple. Brackets are balanced. Yeah? Did they do something like this? Yeah, there's Tim Toady. There's more than one way to do it. So Angular has some kind of magical things that you can take advantage of. Scope is a handy thing, but scope, you begin to have scope problems. If I set the scope of this variable as this controller, then this code and this data is nicely compartmentalized into the controller, and it's not floating around out in some other scope somewhere. Right now that's convenient for me, but if I needed to do that, you can pull in other scopes and then put things in them from inside the controller. The challenge there is testability. You're beginning to lose your cohesion. Right now, I have good cohesion because everything's here. As soon as I pull in scope and start sticking stuff out, I'm beginning to lose cohesion. It becomes harder to test, becomes harder to maintain.
This case, first that function.
It does, yeah. This refers to this function which is being added with the name main controller to the controller registry in Angular, if you follow all that through. So, and did we fix anything? No. There we go. Happiness. Hope don't have to pull the escape hatch. All right. Oops. Sorry? We missed the fix. I did a couple of things. Probably the most impactful thing was this. When you're doing things, Angular helps you manage how you modularize your code, and it helps you connect things together. So if you think about the solid principles, the last solid principle is dependency injection, inversion, dependency inversion. And it basically states that, don't try to assemble things yourself too much. If I depend on something, all I do is tell Angular what I need. So for example, Angular, and we'll build one of these, Angular has this notion of services. And so if I required a service in this controller, I can declare to Angular that I need that service, and it will hand it to me like such. Right. It'll make sure that the module is loaded wherever it got it from and bring it right to me so that I don't have to go fumbling for it. What's nice about this is when I'm testing this, it's really easy for me to substitute test doubles in order to facilitate automated testing. So we can do some of that now. I don't actually have a service yet, so I'm going to kill this. So what does that look like? Let's build a test for our controller. So, I need my, again. Now I've done it. How do I get my Explorer back? All right. So I like to put this in a different folder, and I'm going to create a folder called, wait a minute, why can't I create a folder? Yes, it is. Good call. There's a key combination for this. Control WS. Send me those key combinations. I'm all about the keyboard. So, Jasmine is a behavior-driven development testing framework. And in this world, we call these specs. And so I created a folder called specs, and I'm going to put a spec in there for my controller. Like so. All right. There's some other magic that Visual Studio does for me that I'm going to take advantage of right now. I've come to appreciate a couple of things in Visual Studio. It is a good idea. Okay, so a couple of things is we need Angular. And we need this thing called Angular mocks. So if you use a testing framework, quite often you might have used a mocking framework. And the concept of a mocking framework, it kind of saves you from having to boot up your whole system by saying, hey, you know what, that web server that's actually out there in the world, you don't need to talk to that, talk to this mock instead. Right? So you can stub out method calls to stop them from hitting external systems and make your unit smaller that you're actually able to test in one place. That's what Angular mocks is for, and it's required to work with Jasmine here in this way. And of course, I need my main, because that's where my code is. Right? Sorry? Oh, thank you. See, I'm oblivious. Okay. I think I can just do this now. So I'm going to write a test that's going to describe the behavior of my main controller. A little bit of plumbing that I have to do in here, and I'm going to steal from my snippets because I have a terrible memory. That's right, module. So the way Jasmine works is you describe some area of functionality, and then inside there you have a bunch of things you can do. You can start to describe behavior that you're testing for, but actually what I want to do is I want to say, before you do everything in here, I want you to tell Angular that we're using the module main, right? We're using main. So this is the way I can get to my controller. Bad naming. Yikes. So now I can start describing my actual controller. So now I need a handle to get my controller. And for this, Angular and Jasmine are going to work together to inject the controller into here for me. And that's another special thing. So before we run everything in here, inject, well, I don't really need that. Inject my controller. Now, this is kind of magical. Angular will recognize that this variable here is called controller, and will just kind of send you in the right thing at runtime, which is a little disconcerting at first, but it works. And so I'm going to create myself a variable to hold it in. And now it should say hello. I can actually test the functionality. I can say that the controller hello oops, expect that my controller's hello property would equal hello world. Right. So a little bit of boilerplate, but not bad. We can test out our controllers, which is kind of nice. I wonder if my test actually runs. Do that up here. Oops. Visual Studio will do a build, and then I can't find tests. Ah, there we are. There we are. Test passed. So we have a functional unit test testing our controller. Now, as we begin to add in business logic into the controller, we can make sure that we test it. I like to use tests as a way to figure out what I want the code to look like. Test-driven design is a really powerful way to approach development. It helps you to emerge designs in a nice, short life cycle. And if you're driving it with tests, then you're never more than a minute or two away from completely working code. because your tests are passing, and then you break your tests, and then you make them pass again. Sorry? How did I just run that? I went to the Test Explorer and just say run all. So I know that's kind of hard to see up here. So just run all. That test passed. A failing test would look like this. Right. Passing test.
One philosophy is to write the test first, see that it fails.
There's a lot of psychology behind that whole cycle. So the cycle is you write a test, you write the smallest amount of code you can possibly write to make that test pass. Then you refactor the code if you need to, make sure the test still passes, and then make a test for a new piece of functionality. If you follow those tiny baby steps, you're never going too far off the mark. And it involves a lot of refactoring as you figure out, because I'm terrible with names, right? Naming's hard. So I come up with awful names, and it's like, I don't know what to call this. I'm going to call it blah. And then I make it work, and it percolates in my brain for a while, and then I get to the point where the test is passing, and I got to refactor it, and I've got a much better idea formed in my head at that point of maybe what I should call this thing, and I change it. But I know that I've got tests around it, so that if a better idea for a name comes to me later, I can change it, and I know my tests will fail if I missed something, and then I can keep that going. So tests really give you that confidence to just tunnel through. Hey, how far did I get? We're not very far in. This is like 1 of 4. I'm going to step up my pace a little bit. Oh yeah, that's something. We're going to make another controller. So this doesn't do a lot. I've got this service that I'm building out, so all my examples come from this service. So it's like an SMS messaging service, and it has this notion of groups, and groups are attached to a phone number, and so the user interface that I was building out for it is like, well, what groups do I have to manipulate here? So list of groups, add a group, delete a group, edit a group, that kind of stuff. So that was the examples I was going along. Oops. So how do some of these other constructs look? Maybe I'll leave this stuff a little bit in main. Maybe what I'll say, oops, turn off caps lock, stop yelling. Groups. JavaScript array construct, bunch of objects. Couple places. So I've got a JavaScript array of 3 objects, each with an ID, a name, and a phone property, right? So how do I put that on the page? Well, first of all, I have a test that doesn't make any sense. Do we have 3 groups? We have 3 groups. Excellent. So how do we put these on the page? I'm going to assume everybody's got some familiarity with HTML. I can use a construct or a directive here called ngRepeat. And I've got that groups property in my main controller. And I'll call it group for each group in main groups. So this group variable I can use inside that loop. Remember the way this is a DOM, it's all encapsulated. Anywhere underneath that UL element, I can access group. Anywhere inside the body, I can access main. Nicely compartmentalized. So, with any luck, we have our 3 items. No, that didn't do what I expected. That completely didn't do what I expected. Never mind. I was going to show that Angular does a lot of manipulation of the DOM and puts in lots of little attributes that kind of give it hints as to what's going on. And some of them are helpful to hook into because you can use them like CSS classes to color things in certain situations, to animate things if things are coming on and off the screen. So, but we just have something really simple here. That's it. So I'm crossing a lot of boundaries here, right? I've got this controller. It's got some data in it. Probably don't want that. It should get its data from elsewhere. That's a concern that really shouldn't be in the controller. Maybe the data is going to come from this file. Maybe it's going to be coming off a server. Maybe I'm going to read it from a static JSON document. I don't want the controller to have to care about that. So we're going to draw a line. But first, I've reached my next stage. Oh, I missed a step. It's okay. I will show it to you here because I'm running behind. So if we built that into a table with the group and a phone number, oh, thank you. There we go. For each table row, I'm doing the same thing. I'm using that ngRepeat to grab a group variable out of my main groups. But this is a funky little thing here. This is a filter. So when I ask Angular to bind something out to the page, it can do it through a filter. And I've written a filter and a test. Let's look at the test first. So this will look a little bit like the controller test. I have this thing that I call a phone formatter. And what it does is it takes that E164 formatted phone number and turns it into a nice, more human recognizable phone number. Kind of drops the country code. That's okay with me right now for this business application. And then defining the filter. Look at that. I made all kinds of group information. This is the filter definition here. Remember that at the top I'm creating that main module to hold all of my app stuff kind of in one messy pool. And I'm adding into that main module the filter for my phone formatter. And the way filters work is they just take an input and return an output. So I'm just using a regular expression to take the plus sign, the first digit, drop them, and then a group of the next 3 digits, and then a group of the next 3 digits, and then a group of the next 4 digits, and then I'm putting the first group in parentheses, second group, dash, third group. Really simple regexes. Regexes are intimidating, right? They're awesome, though. So the way this looks, you can probably predict, is I have those group names. Now I have the formatted phone numbers beside them. Angular comes with a bunch of filters out of the box that do things like formatting dates and times, formatting numbers, formatting prices, all that kind of stuff. And so it's pretty handy, and it's all in their reference manual. But sometimes you have to make your own filters. So that's what I've done here. Yeah. The next step I did here was I wanted a little bootstrap. That's looking a little too minimalistic for me. And I just used NuGet. To put in Bootstrap. Now, what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a number of things. I primarily use Bootstrap as a CSS foundation for visual style because I'm not a design person. I'm like a code person. Please don't ask me to pick colors or shapes or anything. That first picture that I had up on the screen, that's about as artistic as I get with all the little shapes and the fuzzy diagram. I'm done. So Bootstrap's in. Bootstrap throws a whole bunch of stuff in, so there's some CSS in the content folder. Sorry, this is hard to see. Where did that CSS? Oh, look at that. The Jasmine NuGet package stuck a different CSS folder in with its CSS. That's okay. And Bootstrap also comes with some JavaScript stuff that I don't often use, but it uses it for things like pull-down menus and some more tricks around layout kind of components. So we're not going to use it because we don't need to. So I'm going to cheat a little bit again. Oh, geez, really? So this is big and intimidating. That's part of what Bootstrap does to you. This stuff at the top is all just navigation bar. The body of the page, the only things that really changed were I've got a div surrounding it with this container class that Bootstrap uses for its grid layout. And I've got a nice, oh, no, I didn't. Yes, I did. I added the table class and the table striped class to the table itself, so that now if I look at it, okay. Oh, look at that. Yeah, I got rid of too much. Oh, no, Bootstrap. Sorry. All right, drop you in. I'm running. Gotta call me on this stuff. I'm not familiar. There we go. So I just added the Bootstrap CSS. I could use the min. It doesn't really matter. Something still wrong? Oh, I lost all my nav. This stuff. Looking better. Still missing a container. It's alright. But Bootstrap brought me my nice top bar. Looks much better. Not the same default font. The group, or sorry, the table, I want to put those classes back on, and I put my container back in. Gotta say, I love the auto indentation. It's been okay. And that should look a lot better now. So, have some groups. Oh, let's see, what are we doing next? Oh yeah. Let's get rid of that data. We're still pulling that in the controller. From this big data structure. I don't think that stuff belongs here. So I'm going to pull it out. Pin you down. It doesn't scale like the main window. Okay. I'm going to cheat again. When I'm on a PC, I gotta use a mouse. I don't know what it is. I can't use the trackpad. I use the trackpad on the Mac all the time. Not on a PC. Oh, I could have just done that. I'm not gonna do that then. So I just dragged in this folder that has these data files on it. And the data files are just JSON data. So that same JavaScript structure with that group information in it, I just stuck it in a file called groups.json. Now, there's lots of ways to interact with a server. I'm getting this right now from a static file. It could come from a web service. It really doesn't matter. And at this stage in prototyping this application, I don't care yet. I just want to get some data on the screen and play with it and see what I like about the user interface. So how do I get this data into the controller? We don't have this groups list thing anymore. We're getting rid of that. I love the delete key. It's my favorite key on the keyboard. Okay, so where's it going to come from? So we can reach in and use a little bit more Angular functionality. I'm going to use, hang on. This is a particular technique that I decided I'd show you. Let me dissect this a little bit. So this HTTP thing, we want to get injected by Angular. This is a standard Angular component for doing HTTP communications. And I'm going to make Angular give it to us. Oh, one more thing. Oh yeah, no, I got it. Okay. So now Angular is going to give us this, and we're going to use it to send a GET request looking for data groups.json, which is data groups.json. Now, in JavaScript, this is where things start to get a little bit complex, right? There's a lot of focus on asynchronous operations. When we issue this HTTP request, we don't want to sit around and wait for it. What we want to have happen is, you go do that for me and tell me when you're done. And that's basically what this does. This is setting up something called a promise. Anybody familiar with promises? So promises are basically it telling me that it's going to promise to run this for me later when it's done successfully. So I'm going to use a different form in a little bit, but success and fail are nice convenient methods off of the HTTP methods. And on success, it's going to hand me the data back from the server. Now in JavaScript, we have not a lot of niceties in the language. We don't really have a nice core library to do collections and iteration and all this stuff for us. Angular brings us a little bit, and that's where this for each construct comes from. It's just an iterator. And the data we're getting back from that file is the list of groups. So for each group in that list of groups, I want to take this array and push that group onto it. I did this to show that sometimes you want to not completely throw away this object that we've created here. When sets of data disappear underneath an application, things can get odd. And if I've got something on the screen that's displaying an array, then it's awfully nice if it's always going to be displaying the same array, maybe with different stuff in it, but at least it's the same array. And that's what I'm doing here. After the server call returns, I'm just going to iterate through and push all the stuff the server got onto the array. I can get smarter with this. I could do nice funky things like insert extra things or remove specific things from that array if I wanted to. And that would be much less disruptive for the user interface. If I had 1,000 items in that list, and I carte blanche blew the list away and handed it a new list, that's going to be stressful in the browser. 1,000, okay. You probably need a lot more than 1,000 given JavaScript these days. But this just illustrates that technique a little bit. So On success, we get the data. We push it one by one into our groups. And we get to this weirdness. So you guys familiar with this in JavaScript? So binding. So here, inside that function, it really doesn't know how to access groups. So what we're doing is we're saying inside this function, bind the this variable that I know to be the this variable for you. So it basically pushes this down the stack so that this is the same this, right? So we're taking this and pushing it in so that this can get pushed in so that it's this. It's a weird cascade. If you deal a lot with JavaScript, you're going to grow to really hate this structure. It's the state of things today. Tomorrow, there's some really nice things happening within the JavaScript specification that will make our lives easier. But today, this is what we have to work with. Well, and that's a bit of a lie too. It's dirty. It's a trade-off. Yeah, you could do. You could say, right, and then self. You're trading a nicer syntax for potential scope problems down the road, is what you're doing with that. So it's a tricky thing to do. It's compelling right now, but we'll see how the world ends up. ECMAScript, the next version of ECMAScript, you can actually use today. The environments that I tend to use will transpile the new ECMAScript into ECMAScript 5.5, which is what most of the browsers know now. And in ECMAScript 6, you've got a lot more kind of language level constructs that are helpful. Things for object orientation, things like scoping. So, yeah, I tend to do that and avoid the whole self-this thing entirely. But we're not using a build system here to do that transpiling, so I'm just going to leave this as is. But, yeah. Where did I go next? I'm going to do some triage because it's 7:45. Go till 8? Okay. All right. Let's get this the heck out of here. Let's build a service. So think about the structure of our application right now. We've got this main module that we've lumped everything into. We got a controller in it that's doing group manipulation for us and a filter. This is a concern that I really don't want inside this controller, so I'm going to separate it. Cool. And because my memory sucks, I didn't give myself any help. Forget it. I'm on my own. That's okay. So we use a different keyword here when we're generating services. Services come from factories. It's just a decision, an architectural decision that Angular made. And I'm going to call this my group data service. Thank you. Now, because services are this factory construct, you've got different approaches you can take to putting the code together. And I'm going to take a different approach than we've taken so far. So far, I've been creating these functions that kind of sort of act like classes. And I create something that's kind of sort of more like a data structure. In JavaScript under the covers, they're the same thing, but the syntax looks different. And when you're looking out at sample JavaScript code on the web, you're going to see different styles in different situations, and it's going to be like, why? Oh, okay. So I wanted you to see this as well. It's because this is a data structure. Objects and these kinds of data structures in JavaScript are just key value pairs. So I'll have a group list. And it's gonna sorry. I'm gonna make a function. And should be able to leave that the way it is. And I'm gonna just go a little lazy here. Call that data. Yeah. So when I get success from that get call, it's going to call my function. I'm going to set this structure to be that data. I'll just blow it away. Simpler. So how do we use that service? Well, we have to tell the controller, actually, just by naming conventions, I don't often, because it's a factory, capitalize that. Personal quirk. So I'll get the group data service. I'm sort of walking myself into some issues here. Who can tell me the evil thing that I just did? Sorry. I actually don't want to do this. I don't want to have this list of stuff in the service. I just want the service to be a bit more functional. I just want it to give me what I ask for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this promise out a little bit. I'm going to say retrieve the groups for me, call that function, but give me a promise. And I will move the data over. Now this won't work exactly like that, because the success method hands us in that data directly, but the then promise actually gives me a response that I have to reach in and get the data for myself. But now I can just say that. Give me the group data at some point in the future, however you want to do it, and I'm going to put it here. And the service is going to call the get method, fire that promise back to me. So you tend to use a promise whatever you're doing, anything like reading from the file system, anything that's going to take a while, you don't want to wait around for. So generally for loading data, you're going to be using promises. So really this is a pretty stable structure. Do you want me to trace that through again, or are you guys good? Let's go. All right. So a little bit of separation. I'm going to jump ahead. Sure. All right. I put a lot of stuff there. I'm going to show you the end result of some of it. And I'm going to start here. Oh, look at that. I wasn't supposed to do that yet. That's okay. This structure is what we'll talk about next. This is something called routing. So if you build a lot of server-side apps in an MVC framework, usually there's this notion of routing. Taking a URL, splitting it apart, and dispatching that request to some controllers in your system that are going to actually handle it. Now, in an Angular app, you see how this begins to all layer together. We have a router in the client-side app. We have a router on the server-side app. We have controllers on the client-side app. We got controllers on the server-side app. You're going to have to watch where you're drawing your lines and how you're separating your code so that it makes sense. And it's not mathematics, it's engineering. There's no right solution. You're going to do a bunch of stuff that feels dirty, and it's going to suck, and then it won't suck. But the way that you navigate between screens in an Angular app is with Angular routing. And there's a new module that comes from Angular called Angular Route. And when I set up my main or my app module, I'm telling Angular that my application now requires routing, ng-route. And when I do that, Angular goes and loads the routing module to allow me to configure routes with a route provider. Now, what is this saying? So I'm adding some configuration to the route provider. It says when the URL starts with /groups, we're going to load this HTML template, set up this controller, and name this controller grouplistctrl. You see how we took that table all out of the index HTML, which is now just that navbar, and this ngview directive. ngview basically is just saying to Angular, do your routing stuff and stick it here. Right? this is telling us that when we're in that partial, which I lost the file name for, we have this group list control variable, and this comes from the controller as alias. This comes from the name of the controller. So I've got two partials here. I've got the groups list, and then for each group, being able to click on it to see a detail page. If I run this, what on earth did I just do? There we go. So I have my group list, and I click through, and right now my detail page doesn't have much on it. Now that route see this little marker here? Colon group ID. This is telling the router for Angular that this is a parameter to my route. And it's going to put it in this variable. So that in my controller, it's going to come in as a parameter with that name. So you can see my details controller, that's all it does. It grabs that route parameter, puts it in this variable. Then my details just put that ID to the screen. Not very helpful yet. We need to actually load the actual group. And we still have everything sitting here in our main module. We still have all our controllers, our formatters, our route provider. Should have copied that service out and just pasted it in here to get started. Maybe I have. Oh, yeah. I'm going to jump again, so it's 8 o'clock. Something that's starting to be uncomfortable to me is all this stuff sitting in main, right? This main module is starting to get crowded. I got services in here, and the filter in here, and the controllers in here. I want to start breaking this apart. It's too big. Remember, small. Rule number 4. So let's do that. I'm going to add a JavaScript file, and I don't really know where to draw the line yet, so I'm going to create a file for controllers. Sounds reasonable. And I'm going to do all this in a closure. Now, I'm going to create a new module for this. The module is going to be primer controllers. Sounds like a plan. It's not really going to depend on anything. And now I have a place to move my controllers. And I'm going to add them to that module. So now I want those controllers in main. I still need them, right? But now I can just say that in addition to ng route, I need primer controllers. And the last step is, because I'm not using a module loading system, I'm going to put in my controllers to my HTML. That just worked. So now my HTML is going to load the controllers, and it's going to load main after it loads Angular and Angular routing. So you can see I just refactored the structure of this app a little bit. Created another module, added it as a dependency to the main module, and fingers crossed. Oh, hang on, did I run the right thing? I did. My controllers are still available. I didn't have to change anything about the templates. It's all basically the same. And I can use this technique to keep drawing these dividing lines between parts of my application. I can use it to draw the line between different services, but again, this is where the artistry comes in, right? What are the boundaries in your application? How do they talk to each other? Right? The one rule of thumb I'll give you, though, is you only want dependencies to go in one direction. When you're traversing a boundary, you want that to be a one-way trip. You don't want to have one system that depends on another system that then depends on the first system. That cyclical dependency, that's going to be super evil. So make sure your dependencies always go in one direction. But, sorry? A tree, not a graph. All right. Oh. Another technique that I introduced here that is kind of subtle. Oh, no, it's not. I didn't introduce it here at all. We were talking a little bit before about the scope variable. And sometimes you might look at a directive like this in your HTML and think, well, I don't want to have to deal with that. You know, I'd like to simplify that. And maybe in that situation, you're willing to make that trade-off to say, I'm going to stick that in the bigger scope to simplify the HTML for reasons. Sometimes you got them, right? So what does that look like? The controller for the group list had groups stuck in its own context. But if we brought in Angular's scope, always got to do that two-step dance. This is a dependency. This is how I want you to give it to me. Now I can say, stick the groups in the scope, and stick that in the scope. Oh, and now I don't need to bind. Maybe that's simpler. Maybe that works for me. And now in the template, groups, because it's right in the scope, I don't have to prefix with anything. It's now directly available to me. So in a way that simplifies the template at the expense of messing up scope. Not messing up. I say messing up. That's a choice. As long as you're making that choice consciously, it's good. It's going to get the job done and let you ship code, which is the point. But be aware you're doing it. Right? I want the perfect computer with all the RAM, but I only want it to be this big. Can't have everything. All right. I'm going to go to the last stage. Yes. The scope of that scope. It's not quite global. It's going to be. Is it the app? Honestly, I forget at the top level of it, because you have global scope and scope, and one is higher than the other, and I can't recall. All right. So you can see at stage 4, I've gone through and I've separated out my controllers. Still have my group list, group details. But I implemented this tab panel. Let me show you a bit how this works. When I'm in here looking at details, a couple of nice things. Those little handlebar things, tying or binding an HTML element, contents or property to a data structure in scope. It's a live binding, and it's a two-way binding. So that makes it really nice because you're not having to take care of that life cycle. It's like, oh, the data changed. Okay, update it here. It's a two-way binding.
Stop that. Don't want the data to be changeable.
If you don't want the data to be changeable, there are other ways to present it. The binding is binding. You don't have to use Angular's binding, but it's one of the reasons to use Angular is because it comes with nice binding. But circumventing the binding, there's different ways for you to push the properties around. For example, a function is not something that you would typically assign to. And sometimes the data that you want, if it comes from a function instead of a writable data structure, maybe that's a situation that more gets you what you're looking for. Does that make sense? You know, sometimes we replace data elements in these structures with functions that maybe retrieved it from elsewhere. But
That work for a computer field?
oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's the way to do computed fields. I have this little structure here where I'm using these tabs. I just wanted to walk through a little bit about how you do that, because that starts to get into the interactivity that you'd build into an Angular app. And really, this is the pièce de résistance. This is kind of why most people gravitate to a front-end framework like Angular, because they want this level of interactivity within their web app without going back and forth to a server. So let me break this down. Some of this noise in here is from Bootstrap. A lot of these. The Angular stuff is always that ng dash prefix. So you can see I've created this tab panel controller. I separated the logic of how a tab panel works from the logic of how I want to present group details, because they're two different concerns, right? Where you draw your boundaries is important. Then there are some other directives. ng class, what it does is it conditionally puts a CSS class on an element whether a particular statement evaluates to true or false. So if this function returns true, the active class appears. If it's not there. And active is a CSS class in Bootstrap that gives you this nice, oops, oh, I stopped it. It shades the tab for you so that you know which tab you're on. That's all. That tab controller, all it does is it has a variable that holds what tab you're on and two functions. Select a tab, which sets it, and a function to evaluate if a particular tab is selected, which returns true or false. That's really all there is to it. The test for it was nice because you can see when I started it, I added this extra condition. When I'm writing tests for this kind of thing, you can see the obvious stuff. You can see when the controller first initializes it, it should be on the first tab. If I ask it to select the second tab, it should be on the second tab. But what happens if I asked it to go to a tab that doesn't exist, right? And that's where I put in that if statement, just to provide that sad path or that unexpected, satisfy that unexpected behavior. Oops. So if I set the tab to 0, yeah, we're still on 1. If I set the tab to 5, yeah, we're still on 1. So, tests, there's actually a school of thought when you're doing test development that you don't test the happy path until the end. You know what it's supposed to do. What you want to test is all the stuff that, well, what if I gave it this crazy thing? And when you work through those kinds of edge cases, sometimes you end up with stronger code at the end of it, right? Of course, it's a bit of brainstorming to figure out what edge cases you want. That is all the stuff that I wanted to show you guys about Angular. What do you think? Try that code school thing. You actually get in there and you get typing and you build your own controllers and filters and put it all together. You do the tab thing. There's a lot of stuff in there. They take a couple of different approaches than I did, but it'll work out for you.